rights that we started to speak about last night, we started with the right of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. These beautiful words of Imam Zayn Al Abidin salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi to remind us of what is considered common sense, giving the right of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And after mentioning that the enemy of this person that forms an obstacle between him and giving the right to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the shaitan. He's not the only enemy that stops me from giving the right to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we mentioned the presence of the shaitan in my life is what makes me sometimes better than the angels. Delivers me to a level where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He will brag about me in front of the angels of heaven. And we mentioned that this status was given to Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib when he sacrificed himself for Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi. So it's not an easy status. It's not something that we should take lightly. It's something that we should look forward to. But straight after mentioning the right of Allah, Al-Imam Zayn Al Abidin mentions another hidden enemy which Rasulullah speaks about. أعدى أعداءك نفسك التي بين جنبيك. The worst of your enemies is your nafs, that is part of you, something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created in you. Then the Imam salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi says, وأما حق نفسك عليك فأن تستوفيها في طاعة الله فتؤدي إلى لسانك حقه وإلى سمعك حقه وإلى بصرك حقه وإلى يدك حقها وإلى رجلك حقها وإلى بطنك حقه وإلى فرجك حقه وتستعين بالله على ذلك. So what does that mean? He says the right of yourself, of your nafs against you is that you employ it in obeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then you deliver to your tongue, it's right. To your hearing, it's right. To your sight, it's right. To your hand, it's right. To your leg, it's right. And to your stomach, it's right. And to your private part, it's right. And you seek help from God in all that. So the Imam here, when we see that he speaks about the right of yourself against you and then mentioning the physical parts of the body, doesn't mean that there's a right of this physical body upon me. We will notice later on that he's not speaking about the nafs or the self as this physical body. He speaks about the result and the effect that can be left from these limbs, from the tongue, from the sight. Every decision I make in this dunya, it's because of my sight, because of my hearing. All these limbs and organs that I have are related to the decision that I make, to the behavior towards the people, towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And since some of these rights will be discussed in the next few nights, it's important to understand what is the nafs, what is the self, in order to consider it as my enemy, as Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi says. So here, inshallah, I will divide my talk tonight into 4 parts. An introduction and 3 points. After Salat ala Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad. Salli ala Muhammad wa Ali. So as we mentioned, when the Imam speaks about these limbs, not only about them physically, even that your body has a right upon you to look after it. This is a grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The same way Allah tells you to make money and not to be a musrif, not to overspend. The same Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you to respect this body by feeding it properly, while He orders you not to overeat. He orders you not to eat the harmful food. It is true that this physical body has a right upon you, but the Imam is speaking about the nafs, the inner self, that has a role in deciding what will these limbs do after that. And then the Imam says, salawatullahi wa salamu alayhi, how do I pay my inner self its right? We said that yesterday. What is the meaning of right? It's something that is common sense. Something that before even the Quran spoke about, you have to pray, you have to fast when it comes to the right of Allah. Before that, intellectually, it's a must. How come intellectually and logically the Imam salawatullahi wasalamu alayhi says that the right of your nafs is to employ it in the obedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? What does that mean? How is it common sense? How can a person who's not following Islam thinks that this is common sense? Thinks that the logical thing to pay my inner self its right is to employ in obeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then we read in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, مَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. That the only reason Allah created jinn and mankind is to worship Him. So the purpose of your creation is worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When someone doesn't put his nafs in that position, he won't find the proper purpose of his creation. A proper purpose in life. If I want to explain it in different words, I'll give you an example. People, when they don't find the purpose why they were present in this dunya, they start to search for other purposes. Maybe for work, for example. Some people become workaholic because they think that my purpose in this dunya is I want to build a successful life. My purpose in this dunya is to gain this physical strength and become the number one bodybuilder in the whole universe. They think this is, if I choose this purpose and I reach it, I will fulfill that. But then they reach that purpose and it's never enough. They want more and more and more. And there is nothing that satisfies the inner self. So the only thing that gives me tranquility and satisfaction is to put this nafs and this self in the position that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created it to be in. That's why some ulama, they say that the definition of piety is what? Of taqwa. One of the definitions of piety is to put your nafs or yourself where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered it to be. Let's say if someone loves biology and chemistry and then he chooses a different path, chooses to have masters in mathematics, let's say. He wants to reach perfection because it's not something that is suitable to what he likes. So if I want to be perfect in something, I have to put myself in a place that I like to be. So when the nafs, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created it to be a worshipper and I put it in a different path, then I won't reach perfection. I won't reach to tranquility. That's why Imam Zayn Al Abidin says that the right of yourself upon you, what really makes sense is to employ yourself in the obedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When you do that, then your nafs is at ease. You reach tranquility. You reach the true happiness, and then you don't want to seek anything else. That's why it's called a right. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. I have to know now, what is this inner self? I have to get to know this nafs. As Ahlul Bayt salawatullahi wa salamu alayhim describes it. Inshallah, through mentioning the three types of the nafs, or three levels and statuses of the inner self, we'll get to know more about this inner self. Because there is a known rule that says know your enemy. You have to know your enemy. When you live in this life, if you do not know that the shaitan is your enemy, that's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala warns us in the Quran. Take the shaitan as your enemy. Otherwise, he will do to you what he done to Adam and Eve, as the Quran mentions. Adam and Hawa. So I have to get to know this enemy so I can avoid him. I get to know the nafs so I can avoid the traps that the nafs would lure me into. So there is a short dua that Imam Zayn Al Abidin mentions in Dua Makarim Al Akhlaq, that I will mention it, which will help with what we will talk about today. He says, اللهم صل على محمد وآله ولا ترفعني في الناس درجة إلا حطتني عند نفسي مثلها ولا تحدث لي عزا ظاهرا إلا أحدثت لي ذلة باطنة عند نفسي بقدرها. Imam Zayn Al Abidin, when he does dua, he says, Oh Allah, do not elevate my level in the eyes of the people except when you degrade my level in myself, in front of myself. And do not give me an obvious honor in front of the people except if you Give me humility in myself. Keep that in mind. Inshallah, later on I will remind you about it. So when it comes to the human nafs, the nafs of the human being, it's 3 levels. The lowest level, it's called an-nafsul ammara. The first side of the nafs is an-nafsul ammara. وَمَا أُبَرِّئُ نَفْسِي إِنَّ النَّفْسَ لَأَمَّارَةً بِالسُّوءِ. Nafsul ammara is the nafs that is always commanding on what's evil, always lures you into seeking your desire in any way possible, always pushes you to do what's wrong. This is an-nafsul ammara. So, and this kind of nafs has all the characteristics that are against or the opposite of an-nafsul zakiyah, and opposite to the tazkiyatun nafs, purifying the self. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Al-Shams, sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Al-Shams, He swears by the name of 11 things. He says, وَالشَّمْسِ, by the sun and its brightness, and by the moon when it follows it, وَالشَّمْسِ وَضُحَاهَا وَالْقَمَرِ إِذَا تَلَاهَا, and by the day when it displays it, وَالنَّهَارِ إِذَا جَلَّاهَا وَاللَّيْلِ إِذَا يَغْشَاهَا, and by the night when it covers it, وَالسَّمَاءِ وَمَا بَنَاهَا وَالْأَرْضِ وَمَا طَحَاهَا وَنَفْسٍ وَمَا سَوَّاهَا فَأَلْهَمَهَا فُجُورَهَا وَتَقْوَاهَا قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ زَكَّاهَا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala swears by the name of 11 things. To say what? About the importance of purifying the nafs. قَدْ أَفْلَحَ, those who purify this inner self will be successful. So the nafs al-ammara has every single characteristic that is opposite to purifying the self. And the second kind, or the second side of the nafs, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He created this nafs in me, that it always pushes me towards committing the sin, Allah wouldn't keep me imprisoned to this kind of nafs. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made another side of this nafs, which is considered a nafsul lawama, the part of the nafs that always blames you. And this is where we will relate it to the dua that we started with. A nafsul lawama that always makes you feel guilty. Whenever I do something wrong, this nafs is always blaming me. I have this which is considered the conscience. Sometimes if I do not do my role towards this nafs, towards this guilt, I will lose sleep at night. And if I fulfill my role towards this guilt, then I will sleep at night. I will be able to live a life with tranquility. And then the third level of the nafs, which is a nafsul mutma'inna, the nafs that is reassured, or the nafs that is in tranquility. And this nafs is only for the awliya, is only for the Ahlul Bayt. And in the tafsir of Ya Ayyatuha Nafsul Mutma'inna, it's Abu Abdullah Al-Husayn salawatullahi wa salamu alayhi lidhikrihi sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Majority of us, we are still in the second kind of nafs. The nafs that is always feeling guilty, that always blaming us. Because we are always in a state of sometimes committing a sin, we regret. This nafs tells us to go back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Sometimes we do wrong by certain people, and this conscience is always telling me to go and apologize, And sometimes I do good, I pray, and this nafs is always telling me to be better. So what is the relationship between this kind of nafs and the dua of the Imam? Imam Zayn Al Abidin, when he says, Allah, do not elevate my level in the eyes of the people except until you degrade my level in myself. I want to see myself lower than what the people look at me. I want to be humiliated in myself, even if the people, they respect me and I'm honorable amongst the people. So the Imam salawatullahi wa salamu alayhi, in this dua, he's teaching us how to move ourselves from having the nafs al-ammara, the nafs that is always commanding of evil, into the nafs that is lawama, the conscience, the nafs that blames me all the time. The more I have guilt, the closer I get to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is only when I fulfill my duty towards that guilt. I do something about it. So nowadays, in the modern life, the psychologists, they have different understanding of this. There is a, they have a, they call it, there is a disease, they call it the guilt complex. They consider it a psychological chronic disease where someone always feels that he done something wrong and I have to make up for this mistake that I done. And they consider it a disease. And they offer the medicine to it. Or like they offer to go and seek a shrink, for example, in order to tell you what to do in order to get rid of this state. So this is not our expertise, but when it comes and contradicts with religion, that's when we have to act. For example, I took this part of the research from internet. They say a guilt complex refers to a persistent belief that you have done something wrong or that you will do something wrong, in addition to constant feelings of guilt and worry. A guilt complex can also lead to feelings of shame and anxiety. While a guilt complex may be the result of real harm that a person may have caused, it can also center on imagined or perceived guilt. People may think that they have done something wrong even though they haven't. In other cases, they may overestimate their own role in a situation, believing that their own minor mistakes had much more serious impact than they really did. So this is a psychological case or illness that they consider that it is an illness, while the mistake that they fell into is when they mentioned the reasons behind this case or this issue. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. When they mentioned the reasons and the causes of this illness, that's when they made a mistake. They said that when you are obeying the religious rules and when you are feeling that there's a lot of restriction or religious restrictions, this is what is causing the guilt. And the best solution to this is to free yourself from these restrictions, is to decrease your relationship with your religion. When they done that mistake, that's when we have to speak as scholars, as religious people, as teachers. It is important to warn about this state. So the Imam salawatullah, these people, they're telling you, you have to get rid of this guilt by not caring about it. Don't make up for anything. While the Imam is telling us in this dua, I want this guilt in myself. I want this feeling of humiliation in my inner self. Because if I do not have that, this is the first thing that would lead to lack of religion, lead to tafallut, lead to even lack of hijab in the community. So they started to try to change even the religious speech. They tell you, do not teach the children the verses in the Quran that speaks about the hellfire. Do not scare the children by this. Do not teach them the short surahs, these short surahs that were, the revelation of these surahs were in Mecca amongst the mushrikeen. Back then they didn't have an issue with it. Nowadays they claim that the issue is in this. Do not tell them about the fire of hell. Do not scare them of the religion. So they started to find a wrong answer and a wrong solution to this. While religion tells you that this kind of self, and nafsul lawama, doesn't make you sick. In fact, it revives you. It gives you hayat. It gives you life. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So the moment is aziz. And we mentioned, for example, in Karbala, when Imam Al-Hussein says, ألا وإن الدعي ابن الدعي قد ركز بين اثنتين بين السلة والذلة. It is true that in certain cases, humiliation is a bad thing. When Imam Hussein speaks about Yazid, that he given us two options, either the sword or he wants us to be humiliated by forcing us to pledge allegiance to him. وهيهات من الذل. There is no way that we will accept to be humiliated. But in certain cases, dhillah, humiliation is good. Like what? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks in the Quran. He says, وَلَقَدْ نَصَرَكُمْ اللَّهُ بِبَدْرٍ وَأَنْتُمْ أَذِلَّةٍ. That Allah supported you in Badr and you were adhillah. In what sense? Your numbers were a little, and you had fear in your heart. And the narration says, for example, خير النساء العزيزة عند أهلها الذليلة عند زوجها. That the best of women is the one that is dear to her family, but with her husband she's humble. She has some kind of dhilla, not in the sense of the dhilla that Imam Hussein alayhi salam spoke about. In front of her husband, she's humble. She doesn't disrespect him. She doesn't show herself that she is better than him, for example. So humility or humiliation is on three types. Dhilla batina, the inner guilt or the inner humiliation that reminds me of what I lack. It reminds me of that I lack of a better level in religion. It reminds me that I lack of being infallible. It always reminds me that I am a person who commits sins. And when I have that kind of nafs, then it takes me to perfection, because I'm always feeling guilty to be a better person. And then the second kind of dhilla is the outer dhilla, outer humiliation, which a person puts himself into. Like being in a makan mashbuh, a place where I will be accused. As the Imam says, وَمَنْ يَدْخُلْ مَدَاخِلَ السُّوءِ يُتَّهَمْ. Who goes to a place that will give a bad impression of himself, he will be accused. Some people might ask, they say, well, I go with my friends to the pub or to certain areas, but I don't do what they do. Just I hang out with them. They are my friends. It's all right. But I don't do anything haram. Well, when you go to these places, you will be accused. You will be putting yourself in a position where the people will say about you that you are a person who goes to these places. Or a person who enters a gym, for example, that plays music all the time. As a mu'min, as a person who has iman, who has wilayat Ali ibn Abi Talib, salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi, attending this place, it will cause hatik to the mu'min, disrespect to the mu'min. Because everyone knows that a follower of Amir al-Mu'mineen is a person who doesn't listen to music. And you put yourself in a place where the music is being played, people will say, well, this person is a sinful. That's why in the jurisprudential ruling it says that it is haram for the mu'min to cause disrespect to himself. So وَمَنْ يَدْخُلْ مَدَاخِلَ السُّوءِ يُتَّهَمْ. And there is the third kind of dhilla, is the humiliation that is applied upon the person by a tyrant. And this kind of humiliation takes a person to, makes him aziz, honorable in the eyes of Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala. What happens if I do not respond to that guilt, to the conscience? What happens? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Holy Quran, Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad, وَمَا أَصَابَكُم مِّن مُّصِيبَةٍ فَبِمَا كَسَبَتْ أَيْدِيكُمْ وَيَعْفُ عَنْ كَثِيرٍ. When Imam Zayn Al Abidin mentions that if you want to pay, to give the right to yourself, is by giving the right to these limbs. Because what you speak, the right of your tongue, is to purify it from everything that is wrong. The right of your arm, of your hand, of your leg, of your private part, is to keep it away from committing this sin, which is issued and caused by the nafs. So, I have a role, is to respond to this guilt. If I do not, Allah says in the Quran, وَمَا أَصَابَكُم مِّن مُّصِيبَةٍ فَبِمَا كَسَبَتْ أَيْدِيكُم. Every trial, every calamity that you go through in this dunya is of your own doing. وَيَعْفُ عَنْ كَثِيرٍ. And what Allah forgives is much more than that. If I do not give the right of myself to my inner self, then every trial and every calamity that I go through in the dunya is the thing that I caused. And the ulama, they give an example. They say, let's say there's a family of 5 members sleeping at night. In the middle of the night, a person enters this house and he opens the bottle of gas. And this family, they suffocate and they die. Who do we blame here? Do we blame the company that made the gas bottle? Or do we blame the father who bought the gas bottle? Or do we blame the person who opened the gas bottle? We blame the person who opened the gas bottle. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He looks at these human beings. He saw them that they are defying Him, going again, even that there are some people that they're not doing anything. It's not their fault. The people of Ashabul Sabt, or the people of Shu'aib, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent the angel upon him, and he said to him that I will punish 100,000 of your people, of your nation, 60,000 of the good ones, and 40,000 of the bad ones. Then Shu'aib asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what is the mistake, or what is the guilt of those of the good ones? He said that these people who saw the wrongdoing of the evil ones and they didn't say anything. It is true that the innocent people, they didn't do anything, but every action has an effect. Not only good deeds, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will reward you for in the dunya. Even bad deeds, it has an effect in the dunya. Like one of the companions of Amir al-Mu'mineen salawatullahi wa salam alayhi, he was walking and he saw one of the mu'mineen, he died on the side of the road. The wall fell upon him and the flies are surrounding him. And then as he continued, he saw a disbeliever who died amongst his family on his bed, paying respect to his body. So he went back upset to Amir al-Mu'mineen. He said to him, well, this person is your follower, he's a mu'min. How come he would die such a miserable death? And that person, the other person, is a kafir. He died in a good way. His family is surrounding him. They brought flowers to him. Then Amir al-Mu'mineen said to him that the man who's my follower, who died in that way, he had one sin that he committed. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala punished him for it, so he can go to him pure. He did something wrong, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala took him in that way, so he can go to him pure. While that kafir, he had one good deed, and Allah rewarded him for that one good deed by giving him such a beautiful death, so he can go to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and he doesn't have any excuse. So if I do not do my role towards this self by responding to the guilt which Imam Zayn Al Abidin salawatullahi wa salam alayhi teaches us about, I have to know that every trial I go through in the dunya is from my own doing. Then what shall I do? The best role that I can do is tazkiyatun nafs, by holding myself accountable. Muhasabatun nafs. Muhasabatun nafs. This is how I respond to this guilt. Ahlul Bayt salawatullahi wa salam alayhim, they gave us a way in order to fix this self, in order to deliver the self to the highest levels of perfection, by holding oneself accountable. There is a slave in the olden times who used to serve at a palace. His name was Ayaz. So the king at the time, he liked the wisdom of this slave, and then he freed him and he made him his advisor. He made him close to him. So this abd, what happened? He reached a high status. He became wealthy. He lived in one of the finest rooms in the palace. So the people around him, they started to envy this abd. They started to try to find some mistakes that he done in order to go and snitch and tell the king that this person is bad, you have to kick him out of your kingdom. And they started to spy on him. They started to watch him all the time. One day they saw him. They figured out that every day he goes to a room and then he comes out and he locks behind him. Every day. So they went to the king and they told the king that this slave of yours, that you made him an advisor, he's stealing the money of the government and he goes and hides it in a room in the palace. So the king didn't trust their words, but in order to prove them wrong, he said, let's go to that room that you spoke about. And he called Ayaz. They went to the room. He said to him, open the room. Then Ayaz opened the room. They went inside. They saw a mattress on the ground. And they saw an old shoes and a blanket that is made of very old skin of sheep, and he wrote 2 lines on the wall. It says أتذكر إذ لحافك جلد شاة ونعليك من جلد البعير فسبحان الذي أعطاك ملكا وعلمك الجلوس على السرير. What he had written on the wall is, he said, do you remember when your blanket was this old skin of sheep, and when your sandals was from the skin of the camel? He says, then you have to be thankful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He gave you this wealth and He taught you to sleep, and He granted you the tawfiq to sleep on a soft bed. So what this person was doing, he realized that having this much decoration of the dunya around me is helping my nafs against me, is defeating me by having so much of the decoration of the dunya. And the only way to distract myself and to detach myself is to remind myself of who am I and what is my position in the dunya, and why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created me, and who gave me all these graces. And this takes us back to the right of Allah that we spoke about yesterday, which to be grateful, to be thankful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then the final thing that the Imam salawatullahi wa salamu alayhi speaks about, he says, you have to give yourself its right by employing it in the obedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And how do you do that? By purifying it. When you purify your nafs, which controls every other limb, controls your tongue, controls your hand, controls your leg, controls your private part, when you purify that, then that's how you employ it in the obedience of Allah. But the Imam is telling you that this is not easy. How can we tell that the Imam is telling us that this is not easy? Because he says at the end, you should seek the help of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this. Amir al-Mu'mineen, in Dua Kumail, what does he say? قوي على خدمتك جوارح. Oh Allah, strengthen my limbs to serve you. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, قل لا يعبأ بكم ربي لولا دعاؤكم. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't care about you if it wasn't for your supplication, if it wasn't for your dua. So this enemy is hidden, an enemy that is hard to detect. All the time is trying to seal my intellect. You know, the aql, according to the narration, the aql doesn't make a mistake. The aql is described in the narration, it's like a candle in the middle of a dark house. No matter how this house gets dark, the darker it gets, this doesn't extinguish the light of the candle. But there is the nafs, the shahwa, the raghba that makes a seal over this light. That's why when Amir al-Mu'mineen spoke about Muawiyah, sorry, not Amir al-Mu'mineen, one of the, I think Imam al-Sadiq, when he spoke about Muawiyah, he said that wasn't aql, that wasn't intellect that he had. That was the nakra, something that like the aql. He was cunning, that people might think that he was so genius to a point that he was able to have some kind of control over the people. He deceived the people. He was so smart. That was not intelligence. The Imam says that was not aql. It was something that's like the aql. So this nafs, if it's controlled, same thing, I become better than the angels. Other than the shaitan, there is the nafs. So it's in my hands. As the narration says, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created the angels with intellect only. And He created the animals with lust and desires. And He created the human being with intellect and desires. So if I make sure that the intellect dominates over the desire and lust, I become better than the angels, because the angels do not have the same test that I had. But if I allow the nafs, if I allow the desire to dominate over my intellect, I become less than the animal. Why? Because the animal doesn't have the weapon to fight these desires. It's in my hands either to elevate, to become better than the angels, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can brag about me in front of the angels of heaven. So, muhasabat nafs and seeking the help of Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala. How do I hold myself accountable? Amir al-Mu'minin Ali ibn Abi Talib was asked, كيف يحاسب الرجل نفسه? He said, if he wakes up in the morning, he continues his day, he comes back at night, he thinks to himself, he starts to reflect and contemplate. He says, Ya nafs, inna hadha yawmun mada. This is a day that was past, that's past, and it won't return. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala surely will ask you about how you spent your time in this day. Did you thank Allah? Did you show gratitude to Allah? Did you fulfill a need of a mu'min? Did you أكففت عن غيبة أخي مؤمن بفضل جاهك? Did you forbid from the backbiting of a certain mu'min? Did you help a Muslim? What did you do in this day? And in another narration, لا يكون الرجل من المتقين حتى يحاسب نفسه أشد من محاسبة الشريك شريكه. The mu'min is considered a mu'min is when he holds himself accountable the same way he holds his partner in work. He holds his partner at work accountable. He holds his partner at work accountable. When I'm a partner with someone in my business, when it comes to money, I do not allow the slightest thing to pass. I have to know everything. So the only way to become a mu'min is the same way you hold your partner at work accountable, you hold yourself accountable. فَيَعْلَمْ مِنْ أَيْنَ مَطْعَمَهُ. He knows what he ate in the day, what he drank, it's halal or not, what he dressed, did I wear what's modest, أَمِنْ حِلٍّ ذَلِكَ أَمْ مِنْ حَرَامٍ. So a nafs that Imam Zayn Al Abidin salawatullahi wa salamu alayhi describes, he says, إلهي أشكو لك نفسا بالسوء أمارة. Oh Allah, I complain to you about a nafs that is always demanding of what's evil. وإلى الخطيئة مبادرة. It's always jumping towards the sin. وبمعاصيك مولعة. It adores your sins. ولسخطك متعرضة. It's always exposed to your anger. تسلك بي مسالك المهالك. It's always taking me through the path of perishment. وتجعلني عندك أهون هالك كثيرة العلل. It has so many defects. طويلة الأمل, always having long hope in the dunya. إن مسها الشر تجزع. Whenever it's affected by what's bad, by trials, it will lose hope. وإن مسها الخير تمنع. Whenever it gains your graces, it forbids it from giving it out, becomes so stingy. ميالة إلى اللعب واللهو. It always tends to forget about the hereafter. A nafs that has this kind of characteristics, it's more deserving of being held accountable and being punished. So that's why, dear brothers and sisters, Al-Imam Zayn Al Abidin salawatullahi wa salam alayhi says that it is common sense to give your inner self its right by employing it in the obedience of Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala. Al-Imam Zayn Al Abidin, when he looked in the book of Amir al-Mu'mineen, the book of the Ibadah of Amir al-Mu'mineen, he put it aside. He says, من يقدر على ذلك. And even Imam Zayn Al Abidin salawatullahi wa salamu alayhi, who's considered the best of the worshippers, he was trying to reach a better level of worship. So he looked at the book of Amir al-Mu'mineen, he says, who's able to do this kind of worship? And he couldn't bear it. Zayn Al Abidin wa Sayyidul Sajideen. He describes this nafs. We take their words. We mentioned yesterday when we say stories like how the shaitan gathered the shayateen in order to make that mu'min fall into the trap. How did we receive this information? From the imams. These that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave them this kind of knowledge. The knowledge of the unknown. We take their advice because they have the knowledge of what we do not know. When I want to go into a business, I try to ask people who have experience, and these people will give me the information that will suit them. They maybe do not want any competition. They would give you limited thing, and they would have something to gain from it. While Ahlul Bayt salawatullahi wasalamu alayhim, they do not need us. What they give you, it's for you. In fact, they didn't only give us knowledge, they gave us their souls. Al-Imam Al-Hussein salawatullahi wasalamu alayhi, he sacrificed himself and his family. Al-Imam Zayn Al Abidin salawatullahi wasalamu alayhi, he was on the camel taken from Karbala to Al-Kufa, and from Al-Kufa to Ash-Sham in shackles. And these shackles were in his hands, strapped to the neck of the camel, and there was a jami'ah in his neck as well. It's linked to his neck. That jami'ah had spikes from the inside and the outside. For whose sake they went through all this until they arrived to Ash-Sham. Al-Imam Zayn, one of the men, he approached the convoy. He looked at these prisoners and he saw Imam Zayn Al Abidin wearing a red shirt. He said, Allahu Akbar, these people are in tragedy and the Imam is wearing a decorated shirt. He said, as I came closer, I saw that this shirt was dyed by the blood of the Imam. Then the Imam told him, do you have some piece of cloth that you can give me? He said to him, Yabna Rasulullah, take this. And then when he moved that collar in his neck, he wanted to put that piece of cloth, the blood started to gush out of his neck. All this way, and the heads of their family in front of them on the tip of the spears. We ask Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala to grant us the tawfiq to obey the words of Ahlul Bayt salawatullahi wasalamu alayhi and pay respect to this self that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us, and to respond to this constant guilt in ourselves and to do something about it. When I have this guilt, it means I'm falling short. I am not perfect. I'm supposed to be better, and I have to do something about it. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us strength. قوي على خدمتك جوارح واشتد على العزيمة جوانح. أن to hasten the appearance of صاحب العصر والزمان إنه سميع مجيب. صلوا على محمد وآل محمد.